and then we'll get started. So thank you all for joining us this morning for our third skills mapping session for small organisations. These sessions began after Bond's Safeguarding Steering Group conducted a listening exercise for small organisations to understand the challenges that small organisations face in relation to safeguarding. This session is just one of 5 sessions that the group are planning to host, with 2 sessions already happened that were on culture and being instant ready. This one on emotional well-being. Our last 2 are on training and then on flipping a conversation on its head in relation to safeguarding. Today's session will be led by Lisa, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box for any questions, so feel free to add questions in as we go, and then when we get to them, when we get to the end. I'm going to start by introducing Lisa, who I met when she was working at the Global Interagency Security Forum, and we discussed the similarities in the need of supporting the well-being of those working in security and safeguarding. Lisa's career after university started by volunteering in humanitarian organisations overseas, and she continued working in humanitarian work for over 12 years in many local contexts. Lisa returned from her overseas work to start a career in humanitarian security, and during this time, Lisa identified a gap in therapists that had humanitarian experience. So Lisa made the decision to study and attempt to bridge this gap, setting up subsequently her own business to support this. Lisa has put together a great session this morning, and I'll be taking questions after the presentations, and we'll be taking questions after the presentation. So Lisa, I'll hand over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I will just share my screen. Can you see that okay? Great. So thank you very much to Graham, and it's very nice to be invited to join you this morning for this discussion around emotional well-being. As Graham said, my background is mainly around security and with working with security risk management professionals, but I do think there are a number of similarities between that security and that safeguarding role, and some of the issues that we face are very similar. I think the first area is around having to receive reports and dealing with incidents. This was a question we posed to the GISF members at an event a year or so ago. And these were the words that came out when they think about how stressful their job is. And I think workload, responsibility, ambiguity, crisis, these are all words that I imagine are equally applicable to those doing those safeguarding role. And this whole issue around managing incidents that are impacting other people. We'll talk more about the sort of vicarious secondary trauma as we go along. The second area is the role in which security and safeguarding staff members play in supporting the emotional and mental well-being of others within the team, within the organisation. If we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, safety and security really are that part of that basic need foundation. And if we want our staff and colleagues to meet the, their self-actualization, it has to be on a solid foundation. And part of what the organisation provides in terms of creating a safe place is to make sure that staff feel that safeguarding, that security is taken seriously. And I think the first thing to think about is around, this whole thing about, are our feelings valid? So I first went into therapy 13, 14 years ago, which was at the end of my last full-time mission, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And the first thing that the therapist had to deal with me was the fact that to acknowledge that my feelings were acceptable. Because what I was going through was, is it okay for me to feel like this? Because I'm so much better off than others. I can leave the security, the serious incidents that were happening, earthquakes, things like that, hadn't happened to me directly. And this is really common, this idea of discounting our own stresses, and particularly amongst human service professionals. We talk about human service professionals, it's more commonly talking about sort of nurses, doctors, police, things like that. But I think the humanitarian sector falls into that same sort of bracket. Psychotherapy profession, psychologists recognize that the impacts of vicarious or indirect trauma can be as harmful, if not dealt with, as the trauma itself. So absolutely, your feelings are valid, and it's really important for you to recognize that when you're thinking about your own mental well-being, and also those that you deal with. So a bit more about vicarious or secondary trauma. It's a natural but disruptive byproduct of working with traumatized clients. So the wording of this, this is actually comes from the UK government guidelines for family services. And I've used this so you know that this isn't something that's been made up by the humanitarian sector. It's well recognized across the board that this is a serious issue. And while there are not that many resources available within the humanitarian sector directly, there is quite a lot of resources available elsewhere that we can tap into. Some of the common symptoms, I'm sure you all recognize these from discussions around stress. The one I want to emphasize is the spiritual component around questioning meanings or loss of faith. Now, spirituality, faith are words that have become very much linked with religion. But even if we're not religious, we all, I believe, have a spiritual component that is based around our values, our ethics, that center of who we are. And I think if you're dealing with some of these cases, which can really bring into question what your values are in terms of your colleagues, the organization you work for, the humanitarian sector as a whole. And this can have a really large impact on your mental or emotional well-being. So I think it is important to recognize that it's not only about, your mental and your physical symptoms that you might be having, but do also pay attention to that spiritual component and whether your values are really being brought into question. The other interesting thing about vicarious trauma that we found in the security sector was how willing security professionals were to talk about it. I think if you can imagine the traditional security manager, have to be strong, I'm responsible for this, I can't show any weakness. So if you would ask anybody if they were stressed, they'd go, no, it's fine, I can deal with this. But when you actually laid out the issues around vicarious trauma, and that this was something that was sort of medically recognized as something that would impact people who were dealing with the issues of others, people became much more willing to say that, yes, they might be suffering from this. So it's a really good way to open into that conversation. And the other thing, just as an example, I want to use about vicarious trauma. A couple of years ago, I was working with a woman who used to work for an NGO that supported torture survivors. And she spent a couple of days a week in a room taking the statements of people who'd suffered the worst that could possibly happen of what man did to man. And at the end of the day, they said, thank you very much for the statements. And she left. There was no consideration that she might be impacted by what she was listening to and hearing on a day-to-day basis. Now, if I ask you, I'm sure most of you feel compassion towards that person, to what she'd had to deal with and not getting the support that was needed at the time. Do you consider you would have the same compassion for yourself when you think about the work you do? And this is very common, is that we don't give ourselves the same level of compassion as we would give other people. So I want you to think about that and make sure that, you know, when you think about others, and yes, they deserve compassion, is to remember you deserve compassion as well. And you need to think about that for yourself. So when we talk about resilience, what is it we mean? If you just take the definition from the Oxford Dictionary, it's about recovering, it's about toughness, springing back into shape, elasticity. So this is the traditional definition. The American Psychological Association, and this tends to be the definition used within this sector, the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of stress. So this is the other thing to remember. It's not just about those individual incidents, things that we automatically think, oh, will there be PTSD? But long-term levels of stress that we get just from the working environment. But I don't think these definitions go far enough. And that idea of bounce back, I think, comes from the fact that the definition was originally from, you know, the physical sciences. But in the human context, I think we need to look a little bit further, because the thing is with trauma or stress, it changes us. And I think one of the things that continue to stress us is this idea that we bounce back, that we're going to be the same as we want to be the same as we were before. But the thing is, that's unlikely, because dealing with trauma, dealing with long-term load of stress, the cortisol it produces and things like that, it does change us both physically and mentally. So this idea of emerging from difficulty stronger, wiser, and more able. I mean, I hate to use the humanitarian sort of catchphrase, build back better. Perhaps if we think about that we can grow from trauma and dealing with stress, but we're not going to necessarily be the same as we were before. This is a visualization that I find really useful when we think about our stress and where we are with our personal stress. We think that each of us is a container, a bucket, our stress bucket. And that container is a different size for everybody. But that container, if we think about stress as the water, each container can hold a certain amount of stress, a certain amount of water. But as life goes on, we fill our stress bucket with all sorts of things that are happening. It might be at work, it might be the cases that we're dealing with, it might be our colleagues, things that are happening there, but it might also be at home, it might be neighbours, it might be children. So each of these things adds a boulder, a pebble to our stress bucket. So using Archimedes' theory, obviously the water level rises, our stress level rises until the bucket is no longer big enough. And here we get the overflow. And this is where we're overwhelmed by everything that's going on, and we can no longer manage and process the stress that we have. So if you think about this, is if an incident happens and this sort of rock comes along, if you're in place A, the incident happens, you have sufficient resilience, you have sufficient capacity to absorb that rock as it comes in and process it and manage it. However, if you're in position B, where your stress bucket is already quite full, you're going to overflow very quickly. You're going to be overwhelmed by the situation. And this adds to our frustration because we think, well, I always used to be able to deal with that. Why can't I deal with this now? So we add another level of stress, another little pebble in that is about why can't I deal with this? Because I always used to be able to. I think we've probably all have seen these sorts of things before about individual coping strategies. So there might be things like the employee assistance program, which can actually help you deal with the individual rocks, reduce their size, perhaps within the bucket. But also we can reduce that amount of water. Meditation, mindfulness, yoga, I know very popular. Exercise brings out endorphins, which makes us feel better. I don't like exercise. I prefer dance. You know, there's a dance as if nobody's watching. It's great. It might be reading and other gentle pleasures that we have to reduce that level of stress. And it's not just about ourselves. It's also about what is our management doing. You know, time that we spend with family and friends. And do we have a sense of community? Are we dealing with this on our own? Or are there people around us? And I'll come back to that a bit more, because if we start thinking about who we are as a team, and our idea of team resilience, each one of us within that team is going to have our own size container, our own number of rocks, be overwhelmed, be close to overwhelm, actually be very well from an emotional well-being perspective. But what we also need to remember is you can have a lot of resilient individuals, but it doesn't necessarily give you a resilient team. And if you think about the capacity of the team as a whole to respond to incidents, to deal with shocks, and to be able to continue to function, you need to also think about that team resilience. And this is often where management go down the line and we go, well, we've got an employee assistance program, which is great, but all that does is help individuals. It doesn't build the bigger picture around team resilience. So what we need for team resilience is peer support, it's community. Who are those people that we can engage with that make us have this sense of community? And the thing I think for safeguarding professionals, and again where we have a similarity with the security professionals, it may not be a full-time role, it may just be part of a bigger role that you're doing. There may be very few people working on safeguarding within your organization. So you may well end up with two different community groups. One that is your immediate colleagues, those people that you're working with on a day-to-day basis. But the other is professional peers. And I think this is so important when you're working on a topic which is so stressful because of the vicarious trauma and the secondary trauma and the impact on our own sort of values. Having a safe space where you can talk with other people who understand what it is that you're dealing with and the issues that are there, and obviously with all the confidentiality issues, but being able to talk in generalities with others who understand the situation can be so important. So how do we create that sense of community? Understanding, get time to know your colleagues and your peers. And I think we all do it. And there's certainly, for some managers more than others, there's an expectation that problems from home stay at home. When you're at work, you're dealing with work. But if you think about that stress bucket, those boulders don't go away when you come into the office. So understanding what might be impacting your colleagues, you know, if somebody comes to work and they're really grumpy, is it just because they're grumpy, or has something happened at home that they're struggling with dealing with? We talk a lot in the sector now about duty of care, whether that's legal or ethical. However, and going back to one of my early therapists that I worked with, what about our duty of caring? actually caring for our colleagues and our peers and caring for that group of people. How are you? Say it in the morning, actually mean it. Listen to the answer. If you know somebody is dealing with a difficult issue, ask them how it is going. Show that they're not alone. And show that you're listening, active listening, we often talk about. But really acknowledging that people's feelings, that their emotions are valid is so important. Letting people feel seen and recognized for what it is they're doing can really support them and help create that trust and engagement that you need in this community. And understanding team dynamics is so important. There was a very sad case a few years ago of a senior Amnesty International staff member who committed suicide. The report is open source, so this isn't the public domain. He'd worked for Amnesty International for a long time. They restructured, but he didn't want to be relocated to Nairobi. So they agreed that he could have space in the Amnesty France office. And he sat there, and on the surface, he was part of this bustling office. People talked to him on the way past, but he was isolated because he wasn't part of the Amnesty France team, and he wasn't really part of the Amnesty International team. And he committed suicide because of his feelings of isolation. So when you think about team dynamics, it's not just what's there on the surface, but what's actually happening on underneath. Are people engaging with the team? And just going back to our individual coping strategies, that sense of community also helps our individual resilience. So not only are we building a more resilient team, but it's also feeding very much into making more resilient individuals as well. So it works on multiple levels. We can't do all this on our own. There is also an organizational responsibility to create this psychosocial safety climate within which we should be working. There's 4 areas that have been identified for this: the commitment of management, priority that it's given, that it's well communicated, and that there's participation and involvement. It's not just something that's decided at senior level and sent down the organization. I think we all know examples of where organizations have tried to do that. These are just some possible strategies. It will depend very much on your organization. Also where you sit within the organizational hierarchy in terms of how much influence you actually have on this. But I think if we go back to considering how important the role of safeguarding officers, along with security officers, in creating those basic needs for people and having a safe and secure environment for people to work, for people to be effective, I do hope that you have some influence in terms of this, not only looking after your individual well-being, but recognizing the role you have in that broader mental well-being of the organization. So these are just some ideas that you might want to think about. So that's me, finished. I hope you found that interesting and useful. If you want to find out more about me or get in touch, this is where you can find me. Thank you very much, Graham.
Thank you, Lisa. Just a couple of things that have come in the chat box already. One being around your illustrations on the buckets and the being really well received, and I think we all agree with that. I think we've seen them in other formats, and it's nice to have that reminder. Yeah, an expanse on that is that the boulders are an excellent illustration for professionals who work closely with trauma survivors and experience an overload of empathy leading to emotional exhaustion. Really sort of relevant. But what I really enjoyed of those buckets illustration was the then putting them into a team, and I took a note that we want that says each one of us in a team is going to have our own size container and our own amount of rocks, and I really sort of liked that. We have had a question coming quite early doors. I'll throw your way if that's okay. And it says that as practitioners, how do we balance the need to be resilient and accepting of vicarious trauma? Any known thresholds of signs and symptoms?
I think the first thing is acknowledging that it happens. And I think that is the starting point, is recognizing that it's there. In terms of signs and symptoms, I think very similar to other levels of stress and burnout. And I think a lot of the time it isn't going to be a sort of a single incident, but it's going to work much more on this sort of build-up of stress, sort of burnout type process. So changes in behavior, you know, are we grumpier than normal? Are we, do we find everything too much? I mean, this term overwhelm, I think, is one that's really important to recognize. Are we finding it harder and harder to do stuff we enjoy? And this is one of the problems, particularly when I think with human service professionals, people whose driver isn't necessarily financial, we tend to put our work first. So we stop making time for friends, we stop making time for sport and exercise. So recognizing that. But one of the difficult things is recognizing it in ourselves, because if it is a slow build up and a slow change, we often don't notice it. So this is again where that peer support idea is so important, because other people are more likely to notice changes in behavior.
And I think I can add there that behavior is a communication, isn't it? So we need to be really mindful in our teams of a change of behavior in our colleagues. And we often think about people going towards low mood if they're feeling burnout or stressed, but it could be that complete other way. We might have that person that's an introvert and they all of a sudden very much overnight become an extrovert, and that's a real change in behavior, and there's something going on there. It might be related to burnout and what's going on in their work life, but it could be something else. But yeah, it's that change in behavior, isn't it? Thank you, Lisa. I hope that supports today. Next one, Lisa, I'll go keep going. We'll fire through them. Says, well done, Lisa. Lots of praise for you in the chat there. But I'm wondering strategic measures in an organisation put in place for supporting emotional well-being for practitioners who operate in context. Like in humanitarian settings in Africa or other parts of the world, we have general conditions of community is traumatic, but also with poorly developed emotional support system like counselling, etc. So I think to summarise there, yeah, what sort of strategic measures can an organisation put in place to support this?
Recognizing the importance of it, and allowing time. It takes very little for a manager to change their practices in terms of checking in with staff, and talking them and seeing how things are going. And I think you're right about, you know, often we see a sense of community, and particularly when there's been a serious incident, you often get that sense of community. But it is an organization that recognizes the value of that and supports the value of it. And sometimes really simple things, and I'm just thinking back of one organization I worked for, based in a field location, which was obviously several hours different time zone to my headquarters. And they had very little understanding of when my working day finished, particularly when I was on a Friday, Saturday weekend, as opposed to a Saturday, Sunday weekend, or more often a one day off on Friday. So what I did was I bought a clock, which I took into the headquarters office and set it to the time that I was working in, and hung it over the desk of my desk officer to remind them when at their 5 o'clock they were thinking about going home, that they should actually remember that it was 9 o'clock my time. So I think real quite simple steps where management are demonstrating that they care and they take this time, and it goes back to this idea of caring rather than just you know, what is our legal duty of care? I'm sorry, that went off as a bit of a ramble. I hope it answered the question.
No, I got it, and I'm sure Richard did too.
Sorry,
But
can I add something else to it that comes to mind? Local coping strategies are so important, and there's often a tendency again to design what needs to happen at headquarters, and it doesn't necessarily take into account what local staff, national staff understand as a good way to cope. And just, sorry, another example from the Philippines. The headquarters gave me money to do a retreat, and they said, you know, bring in somebody to facilitate a conversation and talk about what's going on. And I presented this to my team, and it was only a little team, and they were sort of sitting there looking very glum. And I said, oh, does this not, you know, interest you? And they said, we've talked about stuff enough, can we just go and have some fun? So I took the money and we went to the beach for 2 days. We had an amazing time, and we felt much better for it as a team afterwards. So, you know, recognizing that wherever you are has coping strategies, and something designed somewhere else in the world isn't necessarily right.
When it brings back to that locally led development in terms of we need to empower the people, the context that we're working in, understand what works for them. And yeah, maybe not try and just fit them to our Western sort of ways of thinking. We need to sit in a room and talk about this. That's an amazing thought and a really locally led thought. So thank you, Lisa. Another question, which is around employee assistance programs. So thank you, Lisa, very interesting. You mentioned the EAP, which is available to us in the UK, but not always to colleagues, staff, consultants who are overseas. Do you have any details? You don't have to answer this one now. You can have a think about this. If you do have any, we can refer afterwards. But do you have any details of organisations that we can signpost this to kind of assistance to outside of the UK? And then a caveat follow up to that is not I'm suggesting that this will take place of the colleague and peer support, because obviously that was an important part of the
no, I absolutely agree. And a lot of times, you know, the EAP is sold on the fact that it has global reach, but staff might be in, you know, far-flung locations that don't have good reception. They might not even have international dialing possibilities. You know, what languages is it in, and things like that. So yes, there can be a lot of limitations. Also knowing who is going to answer the phone, because this is one of the reasons why I sort of trained as a therapist, was to find people, and there's a growing pool of people who actually understand the sector. So having people answer the phone, and as somebody said to me, I had a really good conversation for an hour, but they had no understanding of where I was. So we didn't actually achieve anything. So there are a couple of organizations who do have a large number of sort of an international pool, and I'm happy to share that information with Graham. What some organizations do, which is a slightly different approach, is they create a pool of individuals who have all been sort of vetted by the team, but do not belong to an employee assistance program. So individuals can then search through that directory and pick the therapist that suits them. So they can look for experience, they can look for languages, they can look for nationalities. Again, these registers may end up being predominantly white women if you're not careful. But there is that possibility, and it does give organizations much more scope to bring in people who are appropriate in response for their staff.
Amazing, thank you, Lisa. And I know that financial challenges can be tricky, and how we prioritize that money, especially in our small organizations. But you said around creating a psychosocial safety climate, and I think maybe that's something that small organisations need to consider and prioritise that money to those sorts of ways to be able to protect their safeguarding professionals and maintain the longevity of those members of staff in their organisation.
I think absolutely that staff turnover is a real issue. There was a report, unfortunately I have not found the report, but so this is from anecdotal information. Somebody carried out a research piece for the NHS in the UK. And by introducing a peer support program, it reduced by about 40% the need of staff actually having to reach out for professional help. So that psychosocial climate has a positive financial consequence as well.
What a statistic. I mean, that's just crazy, isn't it? Yeah, amazing. Someone has shared a really lovely open situation that they found themselves in, or sort of within their work, and it says, so important to dare to have compassion for myself. I really like the importance of building the team resilience. Feeling powerless and keeping hope for humanity can be challenging. Stress in this kind of work, so the humanity with colleagues is essential. That's which is in one of the organisations on the call. We have a clinical supervision by an expert supervisor and retreat away for staff working with survivors in our programme of counselling. But personally, I use the Jacobson exercise to deal with the stress in my daily work. And someone has agreed that they also do the Jacobson exercise. And they said, yeah, and then it's said about obviously your trip to the beach and how that's really great for, not to be advised by our Western approaches. Amazing. Has anyone else got any other questions? Or Lisa, have you got anything else that you'd like to add in?
I think to say thank you to, sorry, I see Julie's got her hand up, to say thank you to people who are willing to share. And I think this is something that's been part of my journey over the last 14 years. When I first went into therapy, I kept it an absolute secret. I didn't tell my friends, I didn't tell my family, I didn't tell colleagues. It was sort of almost a dirty secret. And as time went on, I thought, if I'm not brave enough to say I've been through therapy, it really helped me. I use a phrase that I got from somebody else. I used to work for InterHealth, which was, when the wheels fell off the bus. And that was how I felt. But if people are not willing to talk about it, other people find it very difficult. And this is why, again, the peer support approach is when one person starts talking, you'll be amazed at how many other people are suffering from the same. And everybody thinks they're suffering on their own, and everybody else is perfect, particularly in this social media world where people only post the good things that are happening. Julia, sorry.
Hi, Lisa. Yeah, thank you. It's a great presentation. So I'm representing the Safeguarding Leads Network, is the private sector. We have small organization and big organization. So one of the issues that is always coming is the pressure of safeguarding, because most of them are working very isolating. So even it's big organization, sometimes it's just one man job that is covering headquarters, but also country offices. So what they are experiencing is the pressure of the job and not being able to discuss with anyone that. And another pressure is how do they raise the challenges with the leadership, because they feel like they look at me, they said, to come to me for issues. How am I saying I'm not able to deal with this? And they feel the pressure of losing their job, because they say, well, I can bring someone that can manage this. So I think a question will be like, how do we bring that with leadership and to make the leadership awareness of all these issues without putting extra pressure on the safeguarding leads?
I think that's really interesting. And I'll sort of go back as Graham mentioned the Global Interagency Security Forum where I used to work. And I think that did it for the security officers, was it provided a safe space that you could share peer to peer. and you could talk about what you were doing, and because everybody was in the same sort of position, you know, you didn't name names, but you could talk about, I've really struggled with dealing with this because my organization won't do that, and somebody will go, oh, my organization doesn't do that either. So you create a space where you do enable people to share amongst peers. And I think that's so important, as you say, when you've only got one person per organization. I think the vicarious trauma can be quite a good way to talk to leaders, because that is something around, you can talk about it in the abstract as something that happens, rather than saying it's happening to me. You can talk about it, well, this is something that will happen if you're not careful, and it's there. But the other thing that you can do as a network, and I think this is what GISF was able to do amongst the security professionals, is we produced a number of reports or internal, we did quite a lot of forum sessions around mental well-being. So you're then speaking again from a neutral voice, because individuals within the organizations can go to leadership with what's coming out of the network, rather than what's coming from them as an individual. So that network, that combined voice, can really help in terms of that, giving you something to talk to leadership about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I thought I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent on here. So Peter has shared the uncanny similarity of experiences of content moderators and safeguarding professional is nothing short of remarkable. In the face of challenging and often distressing content, both groups exhibit an unwavering dedication to creating safer online and offline spaces. And that led to me to think, we're working very much in a remote world now, where maybe there is less members of staff from either HQ or from those implementing partners visiting programs to understand really what's going on for those safeguarding focal points overseas. And is there a way, can this support be done successfully online via Zoom, via Teams? Is that something you think that is possible?
It's possible, but it's harder. And you have to create a specific space for it. Because, again, going back to my GISF experience, you know, when we went through COVID and the meetings went online, people said, oh, we miss the coffee breaks, we miss the opportunities to chat. So during the coffee breaks, we would leave a room open and we'd say, go in and chat to people. Nobody ever did it. So we actually had to build in that coffee time into the program, and we'd put people into small groups and say, just talk to each other for 5 minutes, and we'd give them a question. And so there was something to hang it on. Some people engaged, some people didn't. But it really has to be proactive, that you provide a space. I've taken parts in events, you know, where you have like conference tables and you can pick the table you sit on. Some people find that useful. I think what the events I went to were still also trying it out, so it wasn't that successful. But I think, don't expect it to happen the way it happens in coffee breaks in meetings or the water cooler moments. You actually have to orchestrate it or engineer it, and be very proactive in creating that space online.
That's really helpful. And even for us at Bond, it's something we're thinking about and how we can support our staff in a different way. And I think that creating a specific place for that emotional well-being is a really important message. So thank you. Peter will be sharing the slides and any other thoughts and reflections and resources that we can think of afterwards, as well as the recording. So thank you for that. And if no more questions come in, unless anyone wants to pop their hands up for final questions, I've just had another one come in. So another sort of reflection by the looks of things. So people have the expectations that you should be able to cope with the stress attached to dealing with cases, or you do not have the right profile. It's true in a way that, but it does not mean that you're not affected, and there should be space, and sometimes space with the professional who helps the opening up in a deep way. I agree that peer support is essential, but at some level, a professional has a role to play as well. Works in an organisation where an organised group work session every month with a professional for staff exposed to sensitive cases. What do you think on that?
Absolutely brilliant. And I think having that next level of peer support, where again, you know, monthly meetings with a professional, you're taking it to another level, but you're also building the trust within those people. So I imagine between the monthly meetings, you felt more confidence to go and talk to your peers about issues that you were facing as well. So I think a really good combination of different skill sets for different things. And absolutely true about the expectation with the role that you can deal with cases. But if you don't have time to process one to the next, you are going to just become overwhelmed. And I remember, I mean, this is a few years ago, MSF were doing something where they were talking about, you know, their when they were responding to high-risk emergencies, they would look for people who had experience in dealing with high-risk emergencies. So you would have a pool of staff that would go from disaster to disaster to disaster without any time in between. And again, it goes back to, because of our drivers are generally around helping and we don't want to let people down, and we do feel it's our responsibility to do this, we're very reluctant to go and ask for something for ourselves.
That actually takes us full circle back to our listening exercises, that last comment you made there, Lisa, because that was something that someone picked up in our listening exercises. One of the challenges they faced is that they completed one case and instantly moved on to the next. They didn't take the time to have an after action review. They didn't take a time to see how that case went. They didn't take time to reflect on how they were feeling and how their colleagues were feeling. They just jumped straight back in. And yeah, I think just it doesn't have to be even a significant amount of time, but just an opportunity to take a breath, say what went well, what didn't, how are we all? So important, and great point to take us back to our listening exercises. Thank you so much for that.
And just on that as well, I think we see it quite a lot in the humanitarian sector. If we don't do an after action review, how are we going to get any better at our job or our response or our processes? So again, it's not just about personal space, which is so important, but also our ability to do the job. And we see in humanitarian response, we repeat the same mistakes again and again, and it's because we don't take time to do an after action review.
And again, always thinking about, again, we're focusing on smalls that might not have the money there. After action reviews don't cost. It's just an opportunity for us to get into a room together for not a long amount of time and really think, depick what happened. Another comment just popped in, desensitization to the cases could be very much the problem, as being affected by cases we may have to deal with. I can relate to that. Had safeguarding cases and held so many of them. Start of my career, that would have really impacted me, and then as it progresses, you do just become, it's normalized, isn't it? And now it's not great, but it is normalized.
I will flag something here if that is happening. It is a really common symptom of trauma to disassociate. And while it might not be PTSD, we still often suffer from symptoms of trauma. So if you are finding something that you do feel very disassociated, do look perhaps for some professional help. And I think that's the other thing on professional help is people sometimes think, oh, you know, I'm going to have to unpack my life story and I don't really want to get into that and all the rest of it. Sometimes you just need 1 or 2 sessions to talk to somebody. So think about sometimes that professional is just a sounding board for you to do perhaps an emotional dump so that you can go on and carry on. But if you are suffering from dissociation, recognize that as a symptom of trauma.
And those sessions are yours, that's going into them in terms of the person that's sort of seeking therapy or seeking support, and you can share or not share as much as you want to in that space, I suppose. Amazing.
You know, I warned you there might be a postman. They've just knocked at my door.
Go for it, Lisa. Thank you so much. I'll wrap up here, but thank you. So thank you not only to Lisa, I'll thank her when she comes back. Thank you to everyone else. I think a key message that I took there was you deserve compassion yourself. And I'd like that to be our closing message for all our safeguarding practitioners on this call. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Any questions, I'll be throwing out an email with the recording, and feel free to reply to that. But I appreciate everyone joining us today.